So hello, welcome to this third week of Atheism for Lent, where we go from the mystics into what it's not a great term for it, but I'm going to talk about from the materialists to the mystics, because it starts with the letter M and sounds good. And this week is really good, but I say that about every week because I genuinely mean it. Every week I'm like, oh, this is my favourite week, and then I get to the next week and I go, oh my goodness, I love this week. So this week is a treat. But before I jump into it, and say my job here is to give you an introduction to what you're going to encounter, and there's lots of supplemental material if you want to go deeper. But I want to give you kind of almost like a map or a way to orient yourself to the things that you're going to encounter. But before I do that, I do want to say I want to close off the mystics. I've been thinking about this topic a lot. I'm actually writing a book at the moment, and I was writing about mystical experience. And I was actually talking to Richard Boothby, a philosopher, about this. And I want to talk about, very briefly, 3 types of mystical experience. Now, what I'm going to do is, after Atheism for Lent, I'm going to do at least 2 Paro seminars on this topic, maybe 3. So this is kind of like signposting where I'm going to go after Atheism for Lent. But I thought it would be worth talking about it here briefly, if you don't mind. And if you do mind, you can't really tell me, so I'll just blast on as if you're okay with it. So last week, I looked at a particular type of mystical experience that I'm going to call apocalyptic. And I'll mention why I call it apocalyptic in a second. But I'm going to sandwich that between 2 other types of mystical experience. One of them that really connects with Simone Weil, and the other that I don't think directly connects with any of the readings, maybe of last week directly, but is probably the most popular type of religious experience. Simone Weil, by the way, is, out of all of those people we looked at last week, probably the closest to parotheology. All right, and I could have put her on week 6. So there's a few thinkers where it's really hard to know where to place them, because any great thinker is more complicated than slotting them into a particular thing. So if you ever hear, and I see this on YouTube all the time, people who kind of want to slot a great thinker into a very narrow field. Oh, this person is about the inner world, the individual inner world, and this person's about the external, whatever. And you kind of place, great thinkers generally can't be kind of, placed very easily in one spot, right? To some extent they can. There's a history of the unfolding of thought, so there is a truth to it. But someone like Simone Weil, for example, I had great difficulty knowing where to put her in this course. And I think next time, I'm going to do a revamp of this next year. I'm hoping to put a lot of new material in, and I might put Weil near the end. So maybe it'll become clearer why I might do that in a second. So what are the 3 mystical experiences? If you remember last week, I tried to bring real conceptual clarity to what mysticism is by using these Kantian terms, concept and intuition. Intuition is our experience of the world, of real things, our experience of encounters with singular things in the world, right? This is a singular cup, right? But this cup, I have a concept of, and the concept includes color, it includes shapes, all of these things that like shape a circle. Even if there were no circles in the world, I could still have a concept of a circle in my mind. And I talked about how in everyday life, the concept and then the intuition, they interweave and they intermingle. And regular experiences, what Marion calls pure phenomenon, is a regular experiences where I have a concept of something like a cat, and then I encounter real cats in the world. And as I encounter cats, the concept gets enriched, but the concept never is filled out completely, right? There's always a bit of disparity, and it's like the coffee in this coffee cup. The intuition fills the concept, and it develops it and expands it, but it doesn't quite ever match the concept itself. So that's everyday experience. I encounter things in the world, I have concepts in my mind, universal concepts. And so in light of that, I want to talk about the first type of mystical experience, the one that we all know, and I'm going to call it oceanic experience. And I haven't read anybody who differentiates in this way, but I think it's a good way to differentiate. So this is what I'm writing about at the moment, as I said. So oceanic experience is the experience of feeling at one with everything. And I want to describe that as the complete merging of concept and intuition. And what I mean by that is, in that experience of oceanic oneness, your experience of something and your inner world, mind and matter, completely meld together so that there's no inside or outside. You actually don't even know if you're inside or outside, because it's almost like being in a flotation tank, where you lose track of your body, because if you're in a flotation tank and it's the same temperature as your body and you're in darkness, the boundary of your inside and outside world can kind of disappear briefly. And that could be described as this oceanic experience in which someone feels no disparity between the inside and the outside. And that's what you see in people like Ken Wilber and Alan Watts and Jordan Peterson. They talk about this, and it's often called enlightenment or waking up or integral spirituality, but it's a type of experiencing no disparity between mind and matter, concept and intuition, outside and inside. That experience can be experienced positively and negatively. I mean, people experience it when they do DMT, when they have a psychotic break, but also when they meditate. Sometimes when they do certain spiritual practices, right? You can experience that. That's one. And these are all linked in some very interesting way. I'm not going to say why, because that will be when we look at this in proper seminars in a few months. But they are connected in some way. So there's the oceanic experience of oneness. That's what we often think about when we think about the mystical experience. Then there's the apocalyptic, and that's what I was talking about last week, because the apocalyptic is very central to Christian mysticism. If oceanic experience, it could be connected to anywhere, you could say it's connected to the Eastern religions a lot, not exclusively so, but you find that kind of thinking, especially in, say, Westernized Buddhism, you have that notion of oceanic oneness. The Western tradition has this notion of the apocalyptic event, and that's where, as I mentioned last week, intuition exceeds concept, where you encounter something that short circuits your ideas, that fries your brain, that decenters you, that traumatizes you in some way. So that's the apocalyptic spiritual experience. And then the third is, I want to call the abyssal religious experience, and that's what Simone Weil was talking about. And so when you read last week the different people, there's two probably stood out, but Simone Weil is the one that probably stood out the most, because her understanding of God is not so much hyper presence, something that is hyper real, but rather almost like something that is hyper absent, completely, powerfully, like a crack in being. And the way she describes it, and I've talked about this elsewhere, I won't go into detail, but she uses the example. She says, what does a miser lose when they lose their treasure? Because the idea is that a miser gets some enjoyment from having the treasure, the money they have. They don't get the pleasure from spending it. So they weirdly have it and don't have it. But if you ever steal money from a miser, they're going to be traumatized, even though they don't use it. So Simone Weil is like, well, what do they lose when they lose their fortune? Because they never used the money. And Simone Weil very powerfully writes about how the miser has a certain type of quantum relationship to the treasure. They both have it and don't have it. It's like wave particle duality, right? They orient themselves around the treasure, never being too close to it or too far from it. And it generates a pleasure for the miser. And Simone Weil uses this to say that the universe has to have a quantum dimension to it. There has to be a type of gap or lack or spatiality for desire to occur, for human desire to erupt. And for Weil, religion at its best provides us with an orientation to this lack, and God is a name for this ontological crack in reality. So that's Simone Weil, and say we're going to look at that more in a few weeks. Every week builds on the last, so we just do 1 week at a time. But Simone Weil kind of is kind of connecting with what could be called an abyssal. So we have the oceanic experience, the apocalyptic experience, and the abyssal experience. And the reason why and you know this, of course, the reason why this is an atheism for Lent is because all of those, especially the last two, they all critique the notion of theism as something you can grasp. Every time you grasp whatever you think ultimate reality is, there's a failure built into that. So there's an atheism, there's a theism and an atheism, there's a naming and a denaming, a nomination and a denomination. And that's different from the first proper week we did, the New Atheist Week, which was a critique of the concept of God. So the mystics come in and go, yeah, not only should we critique the concept of God, God by definition is a critique of the concept. So you see, so it's like, so say an atheistic critique says, you know, God as a concept is completely contradictory. It falls apart. It doesn't make sense, right? And then the mystic comes in and goes, yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's necessary, because religion at its best is an orientation towards that which cannot be conceptualized, cannot be rendered into a name. Hence, a lot of religious mystics say that atheism is a more spiritual, is closer to God than theism. That because atheism is a constant reminder that whatever we say, we have to unsay. Right? So that's where we've got so far. That's a far way. If you just stopped atheism for Lent now, I think that's great, right? But we've got a few weeks to go. We've actually got a long way to go. So what's this week about? Well, and I might talk a little bit longer today as well, sorry. Today, we're going to take a handbrake turn. Now, this is a critique of... Remember I said that you'll have the atheistic critique, the philosophical critique, and then there'll be a theological drawing that critique into itself and making it something new, and then there'll be a critique of that. So this is kind of a critique of everything we've seen to date. And it kind of goes like this, and it's very clever, right? These guys that you're going to read this week, none of them are doing apologetics against God, right? In the first main week, you had all of these reasons why God is either an impossible concept or an irrelevant concept, or those kinds of notions. You won't find that in any of the thinkers really that you're encountering this week. There's no philosophical argument. I want to kind of get to the core of why that is. Now, what you're going to discover this week is some of the people, well, there's Feuerbach, who loves theology, loves religion. There's Marx, who has kind of ambivalent notion of religion. He sees it as a painkiller. He sees it as something that helps us with our suffering, but that ultimately can impede our changing the world. And then you have people like Goldman and Hill, who have kind of very negative notions of religion. So you've kind of got from the positive right through to the negative this week. But there is something that holds them all together. And Feuerbach is the key to that. And Feuerbach is my favourite humanist thinker. I love Feuerbach. I've become more critical of him over the years, but I still very much enjoy him. And where Feuerbach starts is he could say that, he goes, well, here's the thing, forget about the mystics. That's great. These mystical experiences people can have, that's wonderful. That was William last week said, sometimes it seems a bit individualistic. You know, you go off, you can have this personal experience, that's fine. Feuerbach's not against that. But Feuerbach says, well, but I'm interested in what religion is historically. I'm interested in what we do say about God, not what we don't say. I'm interested in how religion helps us interact with people, how it's connected to helping the poor, or how it's connected to war, or how it's connected to how we produce products, how we distribute products. Basically, he's saying, like, the religion of people in the pews, religion is very earthy. You know, it's very much about what we do with our bodies and what we do with other people's bodies. And so Feuerbach doesn't deny or give an argument against the existence of God. He just goes, what I'm interested in is what religion is to the majority of religious people. Not like these individual kind of momentary experiences that people have, but what does it mean in their everyday lives? So he wants to analyze that. And Feuerbach is the first to offer a really interesting alternative understanding of where religion comes from that is not about it coming down from above, right? And to unpack it, there's so much to unpack and we can't do it all, but I'm going to start with the notion of projection, right? So projection is a concept that's used in psychoanalysis, and the reason why I'm starting here is because we all kind of know what projection means. We all talk about it to some extent. It's a concept that started in philosophy really with Hegel, went through Feuerbach, and Freud really kind of developed it into a technology that's used in psychoanalysis. And projection is this idea that we take parts of our inner lives and we put them out into the world. And so whenever we say something like, oh, they don't hate me, they hate themselves, or they're not angry at me, they're angry at themselves, we're saying that person is projecting, right? We see it all the time. We do see our friends, people around us, ourselves, will often see something outside of ourselves that's really within us. That's what projection is. Our unknown face is put onto the face of the other. And this is very central to the theory of how we become subjects. That it's called the mirror phase, that when a baby is born, a few months after that birth, the infant begins to recognize themselves in the mirror of other people. It might even be a literal mirror, or the mirror of their brother or their sister or other people. And say your mother will point to your brother and say, "You're just like your brother," or "You're just like your dad," or "You're just like me," or put you in front of the mirror and say, "Look, that's you in the mirror." And what happens is, before the child has a sense of themselves, they have a sense of another, and then they see in the other themselves, because whenever the parent is going, "You're just like that," they see an external object, and then they go, "I'm like that." So the child feels anxious, not in control of their body, they can't really do very much, but they see other people and they see themselves in the other. So you'll notice, for example, kids need to be looked at almost continually. And that's not just because they might hurt themselves, right? Kids might hurt themselves, but there's a need for most children, not all children. There's children, and autism is an example of this, where a child can seem to be very unperturbed by needing to be seen by another. But we're talking about most children, you'll notice that they really want to be seen. And at night, one of the reasons for keeping the light on isn't because they think something is in the dark, but it's because they think nothing is in the dark, right? By keeping the light on, you experience yourself being looked at, being seen by the other. Because in order to become secure in my own self, I have to experience myself first as an object for another person. So I'm starting to experience myself as an object for my parents, an object for my brother and sister. I'm developing what R.D. Laing called ontological security. I don't have an ontological security. I don't know who I am. I don't even know that I am. But as I experience myself being saturated by the gaze of the other and the desire of the other, I experience myself as an object, as a thing. And at first, children often count themselves. You go, "How many brothers do you have?" "Oh, I've got 3, 1, 2, and me," right? So kids will often refer to themselves as an object, not as a self, because they're experiencing themselves as an object to the other. So this happens when you're very young. You're developing a sense of self, and the part of the job of that is that you experience yourself as an object to the other. And projection, crazily, is when you put yourself into the other and you get that back. So whenever a parent says, "You just look like your brother," or "You're as beautiful as your sister," or whatever, you're seeing yourself in your sister, and it's being linked back to you. Now, by the way, if that linkage back doesn't happen, you end up with people when they get older who idolize pop musicians and artists Because what they do is they put part of themselves in the other, but they haven't been able to link that otherness back into themselves, right? So they're always impoverishing themselves and enriching someone else, because they're not able to kind of like identify with directly what they're putting onto the other. So you get these kind of like very, interesting things, right? So, and that's what I think is happening, by the way, in Instagram, for example. Whenever you put a picture of yourself up, say it's a picture either of yourself where you look really good, or beside something that's a status object that makes you look powerful, or whatever it is, that's a mirror image. You're projecting, you're telling me what your ideal image is of yourself. And then when people like it, when people give you a little heart, that's like somebody saying, that's you, right? They're linking it back. So every time I get a like, they go, oh, you look amazing. Oh, that's really great. It's almost like I put the mirror image out there, and now I'm relating to it. So I'm getting enjoyment from connecting with that ideal that is on Instagram, right? So that's a basic notion of projection. And the first person to really, Hegel's the first really systematic thinker of projection, but Feuerbach is the first person to use this in religion, where he says that before we understand the personal stuff, because everything I just said to you comes later, right? That comes way after Feuerbach. Feuerbach starts by realizing, where he says, if we want to understand who we are as a species, we have to first see our own essence out in the world, right? In order to kind of come to know what it is to be human, to see it, we have to put it external. We have to put it out there. We're too close to see it. That's why you often don't see things, that you can't interpret your own dreams, you can't see your own symptoms, because you're too close to them. You kind of have to separate yourself from them, see them, and then take them back. So Feuerbach says this is essential to human beings, it's essential to our development. And he says this is what we do with God. So he says, forget about whether God exists or not as some sort of hyper reality. We create a screen, a massive cinema screen in the sky, right? We find something that we can project our human essence on. And now Feuerbach argues that, this is the lesser known Feuerbach, he has a theory about why we believe in the gods. And a lot of it's very Freudian, or very psychoanalytic. It's like we might be afraid. We want to be loved, but our parents die and people we love stop loving us. So we tend to fantasize and wish for a being that will love us unconditionally. And also we want to be protected, but protection is always, can never be absolute. So it's natural for us to wish for something that could protect us at all times. So that's the screen. We have this basic desire for the notion of a father God, right? A protector God, and a mother God, say a loving God, right? These masculine, feminine, whatever you want to call it, but these qualities, these ideal qualities that we encounter in our communities onto the world. But then once we've created the screen, we just project ourselves onto it. We project who we are. And so God becomes the projection in which we encounter our own unknown potentiality. And this is where it gets really interesting, because he says that basically everything we see in God is something about ourselves. And this is where he says, I'm a friend of the theologians. And Feuerbach was very well theologically trained. He knew Luther probably better than any of his contemporaries. And he said, I'm a friend of the theologians. He says, theology is anthropology. When you speak about God, you speak about humanity. And all of the ideals that are in God are saying something about our potential as a species, even probably up to and including things like kind of eternal life. Like no individual lives eternally, right? But perhaps, that is possible. Perhaps we can, eventually escape our physical form or evolve into pure idea, pure mind or whatever. So like all of these things, from justice and love and mercy to power and knowledge, omniscience, this is Feuerbach didn't know about the internet, right? We get closer and closer to kind of omniscience. Imagine if you could download yourself into the cloud and kind of like have access to all human knowledge. And that these are things that Feuerbach could not have even imagined. But he was giving a theory for a lot of the post-humanist philosophy that we see today, which is there's something about God that reflects ourselves, just like people's dogs look like them. So whenever you see a dog in LA, you can tell a lot about the owner by the species of dog that they have, or the breed of dog that they have. In the same way, you can tell a lot about the person from the God that they have. So this is Feuerbach's notion of projection. And his thing is, it's universal. You're going to find religion all around the world because we create that screen. And what we put on that screen is going to tell you about our own humanity. The problem is this: we project it out, and just like that person who idolizes pop stars and musicians because they haven't been able to link back what they see in the other in themselves as their own potentiality, as their own possibilities, as their own kind of potential skills, right? Instead of being able to bring that back into themselves, they've impoverished themselves. They've put all the money of it that's within their possession into the bank of the other, and they haven't made any withdrawals back. So for Feuerbach, he says that the third stage of religion is when we realize this, and when we start taking out the money that we put in. We start to see that all of the things about feeding the poor and justice and the lion lying down with the lamb and all of these notions of a peaceful world are things that we can create. This is our possibility, and we need to bring that back. So that's Feuerbach in a nutshell. God is a projection of ourselves. Now, I'm going to quickly go over a few others. Could I mention Marx very briefly? Karl Marx, who some people in America don't know, like he was a philosopher before he was an economist, a very, very good philosopher, Hegelian philosopher. And he takes on Feuerbach's work. Basically says, yeah, Feuerbach's basically right. But Marx adds something very significant, where Marx says, well, God is not a reflection of our human essence, who we are in our essential being. Because for Marx, who we are, human essence is influenced by its environment. This is where you see existentialism is the same that comes after. Existentialism is the idea that we can't talk about some sort of ahistorical, pure human essence. Every time we do that, we're talking about what it means to be human at a certain point in history. So one of the things that Marx says in the writing that you're going to see is he says that religion, instead of thinking of God as a reflection of what humans can be and are in their eternal dimension, religion is a snapshot of the ideals of that particular age and that particular time. It's an encyclopedia of the politics and the culture and the aesthetics of a particular time. And that's what makes it ideological. Because what it does is it takes a snapshot of how we, of our politics and our culture, it takes a snapshot of that, but it kind of eternalizes it. It says, and that's who we should always be, because that's what ideology does on a simple level. It takes whatever's currently happening and gives a justification for it and says, oh, there is no real opposition. There's no real alternative to the system as it is. The system as it is pretty much bang on. We can change it in small ways. We can make it friendlier. We can make it work better. But it's the way things are. Right, so this economic system, for example, that's the end of history. This is called the end of history, right? There is no other significant political or economic system that can replace this, right? This is the way it is, and Marx says that's kind of what religion does, but he's not negative. So in this reading, you'll see that he calls religion the heart of a heartless nation, the soul of a soulless condition. He talks about it as being like a painkiller. He says people suffer, and what religion does is it can help you suffer less. But the problem is it helps you suffer less, just like alcoholism, like drinking too much can make you feel less pain, right? It dulls you. It doesn't change your world. It allows you to cope with it. And then so Marx says it's like the imaginary flowers on the chains of our oppression. We must not remove the imaginary flowers so that we see the chains in despair, but we remove the imaginary flowers so that we can see the chains that we're bound in. We can break them and we can pick living flowers. So that's the argument. He says, yeah, religion is a painkiller. It's a way of kind of like showing us what the values of a system are, but also giving us a way to kind of numb us and numb ourselves. So for example, thinking in the next life things will be better. Yeah, you know, in this life it's a bit tough, but in the next life it'll be good. Or giving you songs that you can sing that kind of make you feel euphoric for a while, when then you have to go back to your crap job and all of that, right? So it allows you to have these respites, and it allows you to fantasize about some better future in the afterlife, but it doesn't necessarily motivate us to make changes, right? So that's Marx. And then that brings us to people like Emma Goldman and Joe Hill, who then are much more critical, because they show how religion, yes, can be used to keep us enslaved, to keep us downtrodden, how religion can be used to stop us from really dreaming about real alternatives, right? So it gives us the hope that in the next life we'll be fine, but not the hope that in this life we can change things, right? There's a famous hymn, The Rich Man, All Things Bright and Beautiful, which has the verse, the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate, right? So that's the religious ideology. It's saying some people are rich, some people are poor, that's the way God decided it. We live with that. And then in addition going, hey, and in the next life, it'll all be fine, right? And then I want to mention Freud and then Nietzsche. This all connects a little bit with Freud as well, because Freud's writings on religion are very interesting. I'll just mention one thing about them, is that Freud says that religion is a delusion, not an illusion. He doesn't think religion is an illusion, but a delusion. And that's an important distinction. So an illusion is something that isn't there, like an optical illusion. And one of the things about an illusion is we're generally not invested in it. So we might see something because of the way the light hits an object, and it's an illusion, and we're deceived by it, but we're not really overly invested in it. A delusion is something that includes wish fulfillment. A delusion, whenever someone has a delusion, it tells you about their desires, their fears, their anxieties. It tells you what they want, and in some sort of way. A delusion is we don't think we're invested in a delusion, but we are. And also a delusion doesn't have to be wrong, and this is key. This is key for understanding why this atheism this week is not like new atheism. Because Freud says, I think he actually uses this example, he says, imagine a little girl who has a delusion that she's a princess. So, you know, she's caught in this delusion that she is this princess and she's imagining it. She's obviously caught up in that delusion. She's wishing for it. It tells you something about her life and her desires. Then Freud says, but then let's imagine that she actually is a princess. So maybe years later they do a DNA test and they find, oh my goodness, actually, you know, she's related to this royalty and she is a princess. So the delusion isn't wrong, but it's still invested in wish fulfillment. So this is Freud's way of saying, I don't know if religion's right, or I don't know if there's life after death or anything like that, but it doesn't matter. There's something about religion in which we put ourselves into it. We use it to try to protect ourselves from something, or we try to make sense of something, or to, you know, imagine an all-loving, all-powerful being. Whatever it is, we have a desire for it to be true. And then Freud says, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Just put that to one side. Just like the girl who's got the delusion that she's a princess. Yeah, it turns out maybe she is in some fluke, but it's still a delusion, because she's believing in it not because of the evidence, not because of some cool, dispassionate belief. She's invested in it. She's projected some of her inner world into it. So that's where Feuerbach to Freud works. Feuerbach is talking about how we invest something about our human essence into the notions of God, into religion, And say he says, I'm a friend of theology. I think this is a great thing. We have to do it. But this last task of theology is to die to itself. The last great job of theology is to then reveal that it is anthropology, to then give us back the treasure that we put into that bank, and with all of its interest, bring it back in and to change the world. And that's why I call these guys materialists, not in the sense that they just believe in the material world, but because they do believe in the material world, as in they want to see justice in the material world. And they think that religion at its best might help us to do that, and at its worst, in its ideological form, it prevents change, it prevents transformation. And then finally Nietzsche. And we finish with Nietzsche. He fits with this week, but also, again, I could put him elsewhere. I finish with the parable of the death of God. In a nutshell, the death of God can mean the death of ideology. It is the death of some sort of system where we kind of like put all of our beliefs and all of our hopes and fears into something other, and we fully take responsibility for being in the world, for our encounters with other people. We fully kind of have the courage to be, and the courage to live without the guarantee of the Cartesian God, of the God who guarantees meaning, right? So that's one way of thinking about the death of God. But here's the interesting thing about Nietzsche. When he preaches the death of God, there's two things I want you to think about. One is the term death of God. Death of God is a Pauline term. Nietzsche is taking this directly from Christianity and from Lutheran Christianity. Death of God is a term that is theologically rich. The Apostle Paul preached that the death of God is a salvatory event. Luther preached the death of God, the crucifix, as the central event of Christianity. So when Nietzsche uses this term death of God, he's saying something weirdly theological. So this is why it's going to set us up for next week, because next week is the theological the theological kind of affirmation of everything that we're looking at this week. And so one is you go, oh, that's interesting. There's a theological dimension to this. And then secondly, and more interestingly perhaps, is Nietzsche's not talking to people who believe in God. In the madman parable, it's addressed to people who don't believe. It's addressed to the secular enlightened humanists. And the madman in the parable is saying to them, God is dead and you don't realize it. You haven't experienced this event. You haven't undergone it. You're walking around as if nothing has happened. When you encounter and experience this loss of, and this loss of that fundamental security, and you begin to see yourself in your gods, and you begin to realize that you're projecting parts of your repressed self onto the other. And when you're able to kind of take that back, Nietzsche's saying you haven't done it. You can say it, but you haven't experienced the existential horror of that idea. And Nietzsche then is the beginning of existentialism, because existentialism is the realization that we cannot and we do not embrace this insight. We do not embrace this traumatizing notion that our gods are reflections of ourselves. And we are not able to fully embrace that we have to change the world. We have to be the ones to make a difference. And then psychoanalysis can be seen as the technology to help you actually experience that existential event, and that's parotheology as well, right? So Nietzsche at the very end of this week is saying, yeah, we have to embrace our own existence. We have to see how we construct our religions, we construct our lives, and we have to be responsible for that. We can't blame some other for that. We are responsible for the gods we create, the worlds we create, and whether we do something terrible or good, that is on us. We have to take responsibility. And for Nietzsche, when you do that, you by definition probably become a better person, right? Not everybody's a good person. Somebody might take responsibility for their actions and do something terrible. But it's more likely that people do terrible things precisely because they don't take responsibility. Like in, stereotypical Nazi Germany, where someone's working for the state And they're saying, well, I'm just following orders. It's not my responsibility. It's my boss's responsibility, and it's their boss's responsibility. And basically, responsibility is always being given out to somebody else, right? The Nietzschean idea here is, no, we have to take responsibility for what we do. And when you do that, you're potentially more likely to resist injustice, but not guaranteed. But that's the Nietzschean idea, is that we take responsibility, and that this is somehow connected with this event of the death of God, which has a connection to Christianity. Okay, so that's a lot. I've said a lot, and I'm going to sum it up in a nutshell. The first main week that you did, it was kind of arguments about why Christianity and why God is impossible. It's almost like the anti-apologetics that you see in YouTube. We see an apologist and somebody and the back and forth, right? So that's that type of atheism. Then you have the atheism of the mystics, which is where theism has to deny itself in its very affirmation. And this week, you have a type of atheism that doesn't say God doesn't exist, but says, no, but religion is ours, that we create our gods. Maybe there's something out there. Who knows? Who cares, right? But most religion is what happens in the pulpit, and the gods that we create and what we say about the gods. And that reflects either the nature of who we are, or in the case of Marx, it reflects the historical moment that we live in. And if we see that, that's valuable. But if we don't see it, it becomes religion becomes a tool of ideology and a tool of oppression, which is like Emma Goldman and Joe Hill show that. Freud obviously says again with the delusion, not illusion. An illusion isn't real. He says, no, Christianity, maybe it is real. Maybe we live after we die. Maybe everything about Christianity is true. That may be, but it's a delusion, because we put ourselves into it. What we think we just dispassionately believe, we find ourselves within it. And then finally, Nietzsche, who says that this experience of embracing our responsibility for what we believe is so difficult that we cannot do it. And that leads us into next week, or the week after next, sorry. Because in the week after next, we're going to see theologians going yes to all of this, and saying that, yeah, religion is found in how we love and encounter the other. Right, I'm going to look to see if there's any questions. Let's see. Oh, there's lots of stuff. Oh yeah, Ruby's saying, just finished reading Idolatry of God. Oh, thank you. We didn't know how not. Yes, funny enough, How Not to Speak of God is my first book, and it's very much in the mystical tradition. So whenever I talked about the apocalyptic type of religious experience, that's primarily what I'm exploring there. In my current work, I'm more interested now in the abyssal, but I think the apocalyptic and the abyssal experience are very important. So How Not to Speak of God is very much about the apocalyptic experience. So I hope you enjoy. Tim, any hair is deep and profound, very good. Let's see, J.L. Jones, random thought, couldn't you view God as the treasure of the miser, something supposedly accessible but also unavailable, because God keeps human desire going? Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I see. I know what you're saying. That's good. It's like, and with Vey, it's a difficult thing. So Vey's work's very interesting and very, she writes in notes and there's nothing very systematic. So it's actually very difficult to really grasp what she's doing. I think that the difference between Vey and other mystics might say God is like the treasure. That's God as hyper being, as a reality that we cannot encounter. I do think that there's this element in Vey that's saying something slightly different, that God is the space itself. So that actually might be a really good way to differentiate between the apocalyptic and the abyssal. I don't know if this is right, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, but you might be able to say that if you think of God as the treasure that we orient ourselves around but cannot grasp, like the burning bush type thing, that's a type of apocalyptic reading. And the reason why I use the word apocalyptic, by the way, is because apocalypse means the incoming of something that you do not expect, that you cannot foresee, that you cannot understand. So it's an apocalyptic event. And if you see God as a type of spatiality itself, you're in the abyssal. So that might be a way of actually differentiating. Sorry, it just made me think of that. Let's see. Joel Feuerbach equals humanity relying on religion is just low self-esteem and self-efficiency and abdicating our responsibility to become and do good now. Well, no. So here's the thing about Feuerbach. It's really, really brilliant. This is why I really like him. So Feuerbach is not saying that religion is, to use the words like low self-esteem or kind of like a failure. For him, now whether he's right or wrong, but for him, he wants to say, no, it's a necessary dimension. It's actually, like, so religion, there's three parts. The first is the creation of the screen itself, right? So that's a very victory. Some point in history, we create the screen of God. Then we project who we are onto that screen. Or I'll say it like this. Number one, we project who we are onto that screen. Two, we see it as separate from ourselves, and we kind of like clarify it. Almost like, the scholastic philosophers and the medieval theologians, they really clarify the concept of God, right? So there's these disparate notions of God, and you think of Greek mythology, the gods are fighting, it's all very chaotic. So the first projection is very chaotic. We project ourselves on, very chaotic. And then that systematizes over time. So that's the systematization of theology. And then you get these learned treatises about God. So that's the second one, is now we're looking at this and we're compartmentalizing, we're understanding, we're solidifying, we're making more precise, but it's external to us. And then the third is bringing it back. And so for Feuerbach, it's a completely necessary process. So it's not weakness, it's not anything. It's just exactly the same as the infant who comes to know themselves through having to project themselves out into the world and encounter themselves. And he gets all this from Hegel, because this is all central to Hegel. But you're right, as in what Feuerbach would say is if we don't do the third stage, that's when religion becomes impoverished. That's when it becomes low self-esteem. Yeah, exactly. So if we don't do the third stage, then yes, we become like the person who idolizes a pop singer, who sees themselves as impoverished, and the pop singer as something special and magical and real, and they don't see their own potentiality reflected in the singer. So yes, that's it. So Feuerbach, that's why he says, like, I'm trying to help theology. I'm trying to help it get to its third stage. It has to go through its third stage. Oh yeah, Ruby said, I wonder how much of religion is addiction. My 85-year-old mother risked her life today by driving in a snowstorm to church. That seems like addiction to me. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, that's where a lot of people, and I know in America especially, with the history of America, the word Marx can sometimes send off a lot of negative signals. But what I think you'll really enjoy, Ruby, is when you read this introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which is the piece, you'll see that he has this beautiful way of talking about religion in a very heartfelt way, but he sees a connection, exactly what you're saying. He says, of course, like the alcoholic or the addict who gets some sort of relieving of their anxiety through drinking Diet Coke or through drinking alcohol, whatever the addiction is, there's a way of trying to soothe themselves. And Marx is incredibly sympathetic to that, but he does say that it's almost like we need an intervention. Just like if your friend's an alcoholic, you might eventually get all your friends around, sit down and go, right, you have to stop drinking. And the thing is, it's really cruel, because the person's drinking because of some problem. There's the Freudian thing is the alcohol isn't the problem, it's the solution to a problem. Just like with your mother, there's potentially some deep pain, some repressed suffering that she has maybe not been able to look at, and maybe her church activity allows her to kind of cover over that anxiety to some extent. But there comes a point where you say to the person, you have to stop drinking, and not because you hate them, but it's like almost because you go, well, you have to feel the horror, but only then can you actually make a real difference and break things. So I love Anna Freud said, in your dreams you can make an omelette any way you like, you just can't eat it. Or she basically says, you can make the perfect omelette, you just can't eat it. And in the same way, like in your dreams or whenever you're taking drugs, you can imagine an incredible life, you just can't live it. So better the imperfect life that you can live than the perfect life that's pure fantasy. So anyway, thanks, Ruby. Elisma, if I'm saying that right, sorry, I'm probably butchering your name. Desmond Tutu said, none of us comes into the world fully formed. We would not know how to think or walk or speak or behave as human beings unless we learned it from other humans. Absolutely, 100%, beautifully said. This is one of the real insights of psychoanalysis is how who I am is completely interwoven with you. This actually is an interesting critique of liberalism. Sorry for waffling, but one of the principles of liberalism is that we are individuals first and communal later. So there's kind of two principles of liberalism. One is we are the individual, and then the other is that we can't find kind of a way of a universal truth. So, democracy is a way of kind of coping without, where we're all going to disagree. But so let's just do the individual one. Is that it's almost like you're born as an individual and then you jump into community, you become communal, you get woven into community. Almost like a swimmer, you start at the side and then you jump into the swimming pool. But I would say with this notion of psychoanalysis, no, we actually begin in the other. That when the child's born, there's no child really. There's no child without the mother without the child. They're kind of like, they're melded. And actually, the child slowly kind of becomes themselves out of the communal dimension. So individuality kind of comes out of this communal experience. So yeah, we're so intertwined. And right to the time we die, we're intertwined with others, often others who have long since passed away. So yeah, and there's part two. We need other human beings in order to be human. I am because other people are. Yeah, beautifully said. Question, Matt. Oh, great. Hey, Matt. Do you think the seed of Feuerbach's, quote to quote, people project God, unquote, has inevitably grown into the new age and individualistic people are God? Yes, a shift toward the university discourse. This is very good. The result of tearing the curtain and revealing the Wizard of Oz, leading to us believing we're others. Yes. Okay, Matt, very good. I mean, you know this stuff very well. You always ask very good questions, and you're right. Like my critique of Feuerbach is ultimately, and I got this from John Caputo. He said it beautifully. He says, yes, God is a projection, but God is also a projectile. And Karl Barth, interestingly, loved Feuerbach, but he basically said Feuerbach is where religion goes when it just becomes liberal, right? Liberal Christianity. And what he basically says is Karl Barth said, yeah, religion always tends towards just seeing God as ourselves and ourselves as God. That fits in with the kind of our contemporary notions, and even as you say, kind of New Age spirituality is this kind of like I am God, God is me. Interestingly, Karl Barth, who was an apocalypticist, he said, no, God is a projectile. That's what Feuerbach didn't understand. So if I say it like this, it's almost like God is whole and complete. God is this perfect thing. And then the humanist comes along and says, oh no, that's us. And so humans are this perfect, whole, complete, wonderful thing. So everything we thought God was, that's who we are. But if you go with like the paratheology, the idea that we're not, God is not whole and complete, and neither are we. That actually there's something about, yes, if there's a reflection of ourselves in God, it's precisely the reflection that we are incomplete, that we are full of contradiction, disharmony, asymmetry, and that we have to embrace that. So if that makes sense, as I said, I know I'm waffling, but it's almost like the standard humanist is, oh, there's all those things that we say God are, that's what we are, that's what humanity can be, right? But what someone like Barth would say is, no, but there's something about religion that is about an inherent unknowing and disquiet and a kind of like an explosion of all our expectations. And Feuerbach doesn't talk about that. He doesn't get that at all. He doesn't see that there's something in religion that is fundamentally destabilizing. And that's the interesting bit of religion, is precisely the bit that destabilizes us. And Marx goes in that direction. Oh yes, Thomas says, is the idea of projection linked at all to Hegel's master-slave dialectic? Yes, and that's why in philosophy class, basically if you only do one bit of Hegel, it's generally master-slave dialectic, because that's where Hegel basically, in a very difficult way, I mean it's the easiest part of that book, but still very difficult, he shows how we are interconnected. And by using the terms master-slave, it's going like, you think of them as the most disconnected of people, the one who is in control, the one who is controlled. And Hegel shows how they're interconnected and interlinked, and how self-consciousness comes out of, historically, this interlinking of conflict with others. So yeah, it all comes from that section of the phenomenology is central to Feuerbach. And actually, you know, if you're into your Hegel, what Feuerbach does, because he's a very good Hegelian, he just turns everything on his head, because what Hegel says is that like there is this kind of how would you say it? You say Feuerbach turns Hegel on his feet, you know, whereas Hegel starts with idea and concept and God and all these kind of movements. Feuerbach says, I'll just say that notion of projection is central to Hegel. I would say that. Although in Hegel it seems more like almost we are a projection of God, and for Feuerbach, God is a projection of us. Celeste, and by the way, I apologize if I've got really deep, because I promised that I would try to keep these very, just little introductions. So, but I can't help myself, and your questions are also good. Celeste, can you say more about Weih's idea of God is the space, the abyss? Yeah, is that like God is the lack and nothing that is something? Absolutely, Celeste. Yeah. Now, and with Weih, again, it's very difficult language, but basically yes. I think Weih is the mystic of lack that then some others take on. So for Weih, I mean, and she does have this, like, she believes in God, but her argument almost is atheism. Atheism doesn't believe in God. She says Christianity believes in the non-God. It believes in God as nothing. So the atheist might say there's nothing there, and the Christian says the nothing is there. God is, like in wave particle duality, it's almost the disparity itself is the most real thing. So they would say the lack is the most real thing. And it sounds so counterintuitive, because you go, lack is the least real thing. But no, in terms of physics, or in terms of what Weih is saying, she's saying, no, the lack is the most real thing. The not at oneness of reality with itself. And the theological name for that is Trinity, right? God, Son, Ghost, Holy Ghost as the crack itself. So the Trinity is not one, it's not two, it's not three, it's rather a kind of a not one. But Weih's kind of saying that. Weih goes like, the universe is structured in such a way that there is a rupture, and the rupture is God. It's like, whoa, that's whether you agree or not. It's like, whoa, there's something very powerful in that statement that needed to be teased out. That's why I find her, so fascinating. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. This week you're going to really enjoy it. You're starting off with Feuerbach. You've got Marx, you've got Freud, you've got Nietzsche, you've got Goldman, you've got Hill. So I think you'll get a lot out of this. And I will see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.